I was basically raised in a family of I'll call it achievers. My mother and my father both had doctorate degrees in education, and they emphasized not only to my brother and I, but to the rest of the family, the importance of really, A, becoming educated, B, working really hard, and C, trying to become the pinnacle of success in one's community. When I look back at those days and the formative elements of who we were in our communities, I saw parents who gave generously of time, energy, effort, and intellectual capacity to our community. And I think what that led me to do was always think about striving for excellence. What we did and what I was able to do was bridge a couple of ideas. Software is truly still the most productive tool introduced in our business economy over the last 50 years. And through my work when I was early as an investment banker, I got to see a number of software companies and how they operated. And I ran across one that turned out to be a client, and ultimately the owner of that business, that trust, ended up being my first investor. And that particular business had a set of practices that they used, business practices that helped them run that business more efficiently than any other software company that I had seen. And so in essence, what I'll say, took some of the kernels of those best practices and said, if you took them and as an engineer and create a process around delivering those best practices across the world of enterprise software, you could do quite well. I grew up at a time when desegregation was just starting. And so prior to that, like all cities in America and large cities, there's segregated communities, and there still are. For the most part, and it's unfortunate. I grew up in a predominantly African-American community. We all lived in that community for the most part because you still had redlining, you still had inaccessibility to capital to buy homes, which created, in essence, the basis of a lot of the wealth in America. So it was a time in growing up that I really understood the importance of community, and it was pretty much a segregated community that I grew up in, until we started busing, and forced busing created the desegregation, at least in the school systems. I think the impact of her bringing me and my brother here not only was, for the summer, but for us to understand that our community stood for something. Our community was striving for something, and it was important that we were a part of it. And I think that's part of the lifelong, part of my soul, which is I have to give back and help my community move forward in this wonderful country called America. My grandfather actually was the Postmaster General for 3 post offices here in the DC area. And before that, when he was in high school, he actually worked in the Senate building. And what he did was he actually worked in the Senate lounge, and he served coffee and tea and took hats and coats from various senators as they came in. When President Obama was first inaugurated, I brought my grandfather, who was 93 at the time. And while we were sitting there and in our seats and really understanding and feeling the majesty of the moment for him, he said, "See, grandson, you look up there in that Senate building," and he pointed to a window above one of the flags. He said, "I used to work in that room." And he said, "I remember looking out that window when FDR was being inaugurated." And he said, "I remember there wasn't a black face in the crowd." And here we are, and I'm sitting with my grandfather seeing the first black president being inaugurated. He said, "America's a great place, so long as you're willing to work hard and drive forward on a set of principles and ideals that are important and frankly authentic." So that sticks with me to this day. I did chemical engineering, went to Air Products and Chemicals, and worked in applied research and development, and had some wonderful experiences there. I developed a line of products, believe it or not, called Freshback, that actually extended the shelf life of foods. And then from there went into Kraft General Foods, and there I had product equipment and process development. And for me, my whole life, and at that point, I was all about, how do you create a solution, a unique solutions that no one else had come up with, create ideas that no one else that had ever come up with, and solve problems. It's actually quite an interesting story. I had done very well, was top student for our first year in business school, so I had to come back for the summer graduation to get this award. And as I went through my background, there was a gentleman by the name of John Utendahl, who ran his own investment bank at the time, who was the keynote speaker, and he comes over to me after they give me my award. He gives a speech. He says, "Hey, you have a really interesting background. Have you ever thought about a career in investment banking?" And I said, "There's a bunch of former investment bankers in my class. I don't like any of them." And he says, "Well, why not?" I said, "Well, they think they know everything and they're pretty arrogant." I said, "You got to understand, I'm an engineer. We do know everything. It bothers us." And he chuckled, and I was happy that he didn't take offense to my joke. But what I did was I said, honestly, I don't understand what investment bankers do. I was a scientist, I was a technologist. I thought about the world through that lens. And this is another case where someone extended themselves for me, which is why it's important that I continue to pay that forward. And he says, why don't you come to my office and let's talk about it? So he invites me down and we sit down and we have lunch. He picks up the phone and David calls people like Stan O'Neill. Okay, at the time was the CFO of Merrill Lynch, ultimately ran Merrill Lynch and Ken Chenault. All prominent African-American business leaders, and all of them took the meetings, and from there they introduced me to other people to take meetings. I literally had over 100 interviews in the fall of my second year in business school and figured out that mergers and acquisitions was the only business I wanted to be in investment banking. And I said, because with the exception of warfare, it's how assets get transferred on this planet. It's a CEO level discussion, it's a board level discussion, it's a strategic discussion, and that was quite interesting to me. And I thought I could add particular value and insights into that particular business. It's one of those in America I have and still do. I remember a time when I was actually at Air Products and I was invited to give a talk in California, in San Francisco at one of the big conventions. And this man comes over and he asks questions about, well, how does it work in the extension of shelf life of rice and cooked rice? And I'm telling him explain the dynamics, the biology and the organoleptic issues you have to think about in addition to the microbiological issues. The guy said, you're a very smart guy. You just have your heritage to overcome in order to be successful in business. And, that kind of stuck with me at a time that, after all of this wonderful work that I'm doing, he still viewed me through that lens as opposed to the work that I had done. So like all things, land of the blind, one-eyed man is king. And at the time, technology for us was defense contractors. We had another company we took public, one called Microsoft. We had this other company we called IBM. And that was the world of technology as far as Goldman was concerned. I was our first M&A banker on the ground in San Francisco focused on tech. And then we decided to form a tech group. And so that created another nexus and dynamic of opportunity. I didn't meet Steve Jobs personally, but I was on the team that we actually got engaged. We had to, at the time, you may not remember this, Apple was under assault. Steve said, I'm not coming back unless there's a different board. So we fired the board, got rid of the CEO, and invited Steve to come back. So the interesting thing that occurred, as again, as an engineer, I realized way back in my Goodyear and Tire and Rubber days, the impact that software really had on businesses. The thing that I noticed that is very few software companies were actually efficiently run. Well, why? The big part was most executives who started software companies, well, they wrote code, or they knew a market opportunity and they sold the code. There was never anyone who taught them how to run software companies. So I then run into this small company, I'll say small, in Houston, Texas, that is the most efficient software company I've ever seen. They had some very basic things that they just did extremely well. And I said, wow, if you took those basic things and actually applied them ultimately to other enterprise software companies, you could run those businesses very similar to the way they ran theirs and would create tremendous value in those companies. That was the idea, that was the conceit. I said, well, if you actually thought about taking some of these best practices and putting them in buying enterprise software companies and driving them forward, you could actually do pretty well. And I said, that's a great idea, would you do that? And I said, well, and they gave me one of those offers that looked quite interesting. And I remember my lawyer said, this is a bad deal, Robert, but you should take it. At some point in time in your life, you got to look yourself in the mirror and say, you have to take a little risk and go see. Okay. And it's so interesting. So, of course, I started doing research. It was the same age that others left what they were doing to go start their businesses. So I said, well, let's go give it a run. Early on in the world of software, you couldn't borrow money in software companies anyway. It wasn't until probably 06, 07 till you could actually lever up software companies. So there was no debt available. So the only value that you could create had to be inherent in the business. You had to now improve the operation. So what we now do, we took these kernels of best practices and in essence have now developed a whole systemic approach. Here's how you use this best practice to improve the efficacy of whatever that functional area is within that company. We then have a group now called Vista Consulting Group that delivers. I have over 100 people in that group that actually deliver these best practices to the management team, and the management team adopts those best practices. The way I like to think about it, we install the best practices in those businesses that actually cracks the Rubik's Cube of profitable growth. Not only are we increasing the profit margins of those businesses, but we actually can accelerate the growth in those businesses at the same time. So call it 100 or so in my investment team, 100 or so in VCG, and call it 100 or so in administration. So 300 people in the core of what is Vista. It wasn't until we really finished our first fund. We actually closed out the last deal in the first fund and said, we actually are pretty good at this. So over time, after desegregation, like a lot of the African-American institutions kind of fell in disrepair and got sold off in different parts. And now we've developed a wonderful program that serves our community in so many different ways. 6,000 inner city kids every summer come to the ranch. We also get to about 200 to 300 wounded veterans every year. In the winter, though, when the ranch is pretty much shut down, one of the things that we identified, my wife identified this, was that there are programs, one's called Together We Rise, who we partner with, that actually handles aging out foster kids. So now we have built at the ranch a 16-bedroom ranch house, and we can host up to 30 kids during the holidays. So we host them and do all sorts of fun activities because those little brains are actually focused on outsmarting you because you're in their territory. But the beauty of it, honestly, is nature. You're standing. I think about it. All things in this world that we live in today depend upon water in order to live. I think about water as being, in essence, the literal lifeblood of this planet. And you're standing in this water with your feet on the soil, and the water is rushing around you. And at some point in time, if you open yourself to it, all things become one. And you stand there and you start to realize that you are part of this greater consciousness of existence. The greatest pleasure, in all honesty, is frankly to liberate a human spirit. And when you're able to liberate a human spirit and see that spirit really become its best self, and that person become its best self, that is the greatest thrill on the planet. And like all things, you look for areas that you can bring a unique solution to and solve a problem. I think the problems I want to solve now are an equalization of opportunity for African Americans to help them on board into what is the commercial enterprise that is America. How do we create sustainable career opportunities for people, not just a job, or not just a place to go work. And I think it's through the education, it's through internships. So I hope that I'm able to establish and build a sustainable fabric to identify these folks, get them educated in a series of schools, get them the right internships, and put them on a path to not only be creative business leaders, but also creative engineers and technologists that contribute to what is the fabric of America. So it might take you 10 years to figure out what we've done 45 times already, right? And now I bring that intellectual property into the company and say, here's how we're going to design this a little differently. Here's how we're going to change your compensation plans for your salespeople to actually incentivize them to give you more stable revenues or more visibility into the future revenues and earnings of that business that you may not have figured out or may not figure out because you may not be in an environment, a circle of people who have dealt with that before. And so that's why the expertise that we bring is often more valuable than the capital. We as African Americans have had just a interesting journey, and in points in time, you can kind of frame where different things happened to our community, and things that we did of our community. And the thing I always point to is our not only resilience, but the ability to create things new and influence and change. I mean, a lot of American culture is coming out of our experiences. And music, of course, is one of the principal drivers of that. I always say I grew up in a beloved community, and, it sounds like you guys grew up in that as well, a place where, in my case, it was a completely segregated community. But, the needs of the children in that community were being satisfied by the adults in that community. Those needs of love and guidance and instruction, and everything from learning how to play the piano to learning about science, and in my case, like rocketry and learning sports. I mean, that came from the members of our community. But you also saw the adults in that community defend the community and also try to make more progress. And the 5 Points area is one of the first areas that was settled by African Americans in Colorado. As we moved across this country, and typically it was, at the end of the emancipation period, my family, many of them went into Pueblo, Colorado, but they came from, Oklahoma or Tennessee, right? And you guys are all familiar with Greenwood. And part of our family tree comes out of there. Some of them actually owned one of the pool halls and one of the hardware stores.
And as that happened in the early 1900s and that massacre, they moved into Pueblo, Colorado. And then from there, so I'm fourth generation from Colorado. And so my family are families of teachers and educators and nurses and doctors. Think about that, right? Providing, I'm the fourth generation of my family to go to college. There's very few families in America where it's fourth generations that have gone to college. And so what I saw growing up was a community that had a lot of wholeness, but was, again, being attacked on many sides. But I saw the adults, like my parents, my father and my mother, pull together organizations to not just defend, but to advance. And one of the most important areas of advancement was, of course, education. Being educated, it was critically important to success and to creating, financial opportunity and to frankly create, stability in the community. Both my parents were teachers, elementary school teachers. They both ultimately ended up getting doctorates in education, both ended up being principals. But I look also to the work they did civically. And so we as kids always got excited about snow days, right? Man, we'd stay home. Our parents didn't. Why? Because at that time, our neighborhood wouldn't get the snowplow to come through for 3 or 4 days after it snowed. Now, you think about it where your parents are trying to go to work, but they can't even get down the street. They can't get to the bus stop. They can't, for those of us who had cars, you couldn't even drive because it was just snowed in. So I saw my father lead an effort, and he created a civic association, and they literally went and campaigned and lobbied so that we at least got snowplows the same day as other communities in our city. I remember, and then they'd put one stripe. They'd come down and do one stripe down the main street, and then you still had to get to the main street, and you would get out. And then, okay, great. We got on a bus to go across town because they were desegregating schools using busing, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And you'd go to the neighborhood where the Better Resource School, and their streets were clean and dry. Snow piled up on the side or gone, and ours still had just one strip down the center. So when you talk about economic disadvantage, systemic economic oppression, these are the things that you don't think about on the one hand, but if your community can't get to work, it has a major impact. And we had a lot of wage workers. So it wasn't like, oh, everybody was on salary. You were wage workers. If you didn't show up that day, you didn't get paid that day. If you didn't get paid that day, you were now trying to figure out how to, make groceries and pay, ensure that your kids ate or clothed and those sort of things. And I saw the community say this, when that's not going to stand, right? And take a stand of that. I saw my father also pull together resources. So our local YMCA, our kids had a chance to go to summer camps and to go into the mountains. And we raised money to build a gym so we could actually have a place, where our kids could actually, recreate in peace and also with facilities. But it was them taking that on and making a community projects and us, going out and selling candy and all that, to ensure that happened. And it was, I call it a spirit of self-determination that very much was part of the fabric of that community. And you saw people looking out for the kids. Look, that wasn't perfect. Like everything, nothing is perfect, but you felt loved. You felt cared for, you felt protected, and you saw adults coming together for the betterment of that community, not episodically when something bad happened, but on a regular basis. And that's what I remember. And those are the things that really inform how I like to live my life. And I have an opportunity to do a little bigger platform than growing up there. But it's also, I call it rich with community life. The music, we'd have the Friday night fish fries, and you guys too young to remember we used to do these, people would take pictures on slides, but people would go to people's homes and, bring food and potlucks and watch slide projectors of what they did that summer. And then of course play cards and, drink whiskey and soda pop and all, and play music. And I mean, it was very vibrant. And I just remember that. And that wasn't like I said, episodic. That was kind of just the way we lived. So it was actually pretty cool. Yeah. And it's, again, it's kind of the great segue into, the importance of resources. in a community and the importance of guidance in that context. We were at a time, it was a dawning of, call it the civil rights movement in action. So, there were, we spilled a lot of blood and a lot of our blood was spilled in the streets. And one of the things we got out of it was Brown versus Board of Education. And now it's like, okay, now we're going to desegregate schools. How are you going to do that when everybody lives in segregated neighborhoods? So it was in Denver and many other places, it was a thing called busing, right? They call it forced busing, but it was busing. And so now, the cities took years, they, bought a bunch of buses, started figuring out, okay, who from this community, who goes to this local school. My dad was a principal at the local school. Mm-hmm. And now you're going to be bused across town to another school. All right. Well, right before this was to happen, some racists didn't think this was a good idea and burned like a third of the buses. Okay, so now all of a sudden, fewer people are going to get bused, just as a nature. So rather than my whole neighborhood getting bused, only one bus came to my neighborhood. And so it just so happened to hit on a corner down the block from me. And so the kids in that 4-block radius were the first ones to go to desegregated schools. Okay. And like I talked about, better resource schools. And when I look at the kids who were on that bus versus the kids who were 2 blocks away, okay, it was bus number 13, like I say, ironically, mm-hmm. right? It was those kids have a higher percentage of professionals, went to Ivy League schools, became, doctors and professors and scientists, versus just a few blocks away, now there were some professionals that came out of there, but a much lower percentage. I mean, it is a stark contrast. And it's because in that case, K through 6 education was so different than what you saw in our local neighborhoods, because they were still, mm-hmm. Separate but equal, but it wasn't. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. The teaching, the capacity, the care, and we had some phenomenal teachers in our community, and some of the teachers through that also ended up in those better resource schools because it was that as well. And I remember Mrs. Olivier, 3rd grade teacher, African-American woman, and only African-American teacher in that school, but she looked out for every kid of color in that school. And I'm telling you, that's one of the most important things that made a huge difference in our educational upbringing and gave us a chance to launch and go into the high schools and go into the colleges that we ended up in because we had great fundamental education K through 6. So you guys are digital natives. My generation are digital immigrants. And so at the time, if you wanted to use the computer, it was like $1,000 for a half hour of computer use. You'd have to sign up for it. And you could go use it. And there'd be somebody standing behind you waiting for your 30 minutes to come up. And then they'd come on and you'd have to go sign up again to use the computer because it was that scarce of a resource. And so one of my early projects, for instance, I was working and running a plant in Niagara Falls, New York. And I was responsible for implementing some computer systems and computer control systems. So the way systems worked before that were analog and they were individual. So what would happen is, you're going to run a process and you're going to charge the reactor with the reagents, with the catalyst, and you kind of, put the steam on and stir it. And then the reaction would kind of take off, right? And depending upon the rates of change and all that, you sometimes need to cool it or heat it up. So there'd be an episodic observation of the event, and then you'd have an episodic, intervention. So you change something and it would change the control dynamic. And like I say, if the controller operator wasn't at lunch or, talking about football or whatever it is, every dynamic was different because it wasn't consistent because you had that human engagement as the actual control system. Well, if you put a computer system in, it's measuring those observations thousands of times a second. Mm-hmm. And you could also then put in systems of control where you could have interventions thousands of times a second. So you went from control dynamics that look like this to control dynamics that look like this. And for you mathematicians, everything under the curve is waste, right? So now you look at that and like, So in first implementation I did of the plant, increased the productivity of that plant by 26%. Okay, that's a whole shift a day by putting a control system. So now you understand the power and the productivity that software actually brings to a plant. Now take that and put it in an office. Managing an insurance claim. Okay, you're an insurance adjuster. You know, my car's wrecked. Back in the day, you'd have to go to a place and they kind of take pictures of it and write it up, put it in an envelope, send it to somebody in the home office. And maybe you were on vacation, sit on that desk for a week, maybe got to the right person, and you say, oh, well, you know, you didn't do something right, so you got to send it back to you and ask some more questions. And that happened back and forth. And from that, you'd adjust it and say, okay, here's how much the, you know, approximate value is. You send me a check, I get mad because it wasn't enough to fix the car. And that was a whole process, how things. Now, introduce a computer in that environment where through the adjustment process, in some respects, you have an adjuster who's actually looking at it and filling it out. But now you can actually take your phone and take a picture of it, and based on the, you know, the make of the car, estimate exactly how many hours it's going to take, what's the bill of materials, what's the cost. And so the efficiency from an insurance product went like this to now to that. Okay. That hit every single industry. That's what we're doing right now. So software is now the most productive tool introduced in our business environment in the last 50 years and likely will be for the next 50. So now I go to Goldman Sachs. They're now in the process of, you know, we're using different spreadsheet programs. You guys don't remember because you've used Excel all your life, haven't you? You've been paying Microsoft 30 years for a product that you use. Back in the day, there were 5 or 6 others. There was one called Lotus, there was Multiplan, there was VisiCalc, Asterix, a bunch of different. And so there was always a fight as to which one of these programs you would use. But once you consolidated on one, the efficiency of not having to move, you know, my project, which I did in Lotus, to yours, which did in Excel, because we're working on a team together, that's another efficiency that came out of the system by consolidating. So I'm now at Goldman. I'm now working on a bunch of different M&A deals and started to see what I'll call the recognition of efficiency that can come from consolidation on platforms. One of which we would put these things together called common stock comparisons, where you'd get up in the morning and you'd have to put together 45 different stock comparisons for work that you're doing. And you're sitting across the aisle working on, or, you know, down the hall, working on something similar, and you're doing the exact same work he's doing. You just don't know that you're doing it. And you're both, see all the inefficiency, whereas now once you have done that, how do I share it with you? And how do you, you know, you can do this part and do that part, it makes it much more efficient. Well, computer systems do that. So now we're getting more efficient in how we're processing deals and applications in all industries. And so now it's the dawning of what is technology being staying real. So the head of our department calls and he's like, I think I want to start a tech group. He's like, would you like to be part of that? I said, yeah. So where is it? We're going to do this in California. He wanted to do it in LA. I said, no, let's do it in San Francisco. He lived in LA. And I'm like, well, San Francisco's kind of, you know, Silicon Valley, all that sort of stuff. I said, that's where we got to go. So we agreed. And I was our first M&A banker on the ground focused on technology for Goldman Sachs in San Francisco. Okay. And so from there, I advised, you know, like I say, little companies like Apple Computer and Texas Instruments and Hewlett Packard and eBay and Yahoo. And what was amazing to me, because again, it's a dawning of an industry, is how they all did things differently. In the world of a chemical engineer, if you went into almost any production facility where they're, you know, an orthocracker where they're taking oil and making different types of fuel and gas, they're all pretty much the same because over years they figured out what's the most efficient way to do it. But that's not how the software industry was. Everybody did it differently. Their go-to-market, their product development, okay, because it was new. And so the whole idea ultimately behind Vista is, how do I take the best practices from software companies that I have experience with and deliver those to other software companies so that the efficiency now comes out of that system and eliminate all that waste, right? That's what Vista is. It's a system. It's an engineered system. So My going out to Silicon Valley, like all things in life, you got to look at what informs you and what creates the basis for the activities or the actions you now bring forward into your work product. And that's what it is how do you bring engineering efficiency to the management and operations of software companies? Because our community, it's important our community understand the role of capital in growth. And there's different providers of capital along different stages of a company. Okay. One of the best ways to think about it is if you all have an idea, which you have, we're going to create a platform to educate our people. You're going to start off first with the idea of labor, you two, right? And we've got ideas. We're going to write them down. We're going to put a process together to now communicate those ideas. Great. And so you start off in social media because it's free. And I say, well, how do I now push this out more broadly speaking beyond trying to get followers? And you may say, maybe I should buy some advertising. Where am I going to get this money? Okay. The vast majority of investment capital, even today, is still out of the debt markets. So unfortunately, 70% of our communities don't actually have a branch bank. So depending upon where you live, there's no bank that you have a banking relationship with. You can go and say, hey, I need $10,000, $50,000, $100,000 because look at how, and they don't understand your business. I've got 840,000 followers. And if I had $20,000, I could rent a studio, 5 times a month and get 1 million followers or 2 million followers. And by having 2 million followers, I can go get advertisers who will pay me to have access to, my people, right? And if they pay me, I can now pay you back that money, and then I can invest it more in my business and make it grow. That's the capital cycle, and it's a virtuous one. But our community hasn't had access to capital. The next phase of that is like some of the banks are like, well, there's no hard assets because your hard assets are your hard work. So I'm not going to lend you any money. I'm not sure you're credit worthy. So you can't come to me. So enter the venture capitalists. The venture capitalists are designed to actually look at what it is you're doing in the markets that you participate in. And if you have more capital, and in some cases, know-how and resources that they can hopefully bring to you because they've done this once or twice or 100 times in that industry, they can show you, yeah, take that $10,000. Okay. Don't buy advertising. But what I want you to do is actually build a platform where you can do your own streaming. It's more efficient long term and you make more money long term. And so that's advice you might get from them. And here's $10,000. Now, they're not going to necessarily ask for an interest rate like the bank, paying 4, 5, 6, 8, 10, now 12%, right? In interest. They're going to ask you for a percentage of the company. They say, and when you sell the company, you're not going to own 100%. You're going to own 100% minus how much they bought. That's venture capital. Okay. Now, years later, you're now running a big platform. You got 20 million followers. You've got advertisers making $8, $10, $15 million a month in advertising revenues, and what you're not spending on your team and crew because you're going to give them all raises because they're phenomenal. But now you're at the point where you're making, 10, 30, 40, $50 million in revenues, and now you're trying to manage your business, how profitable and expenses and all that. And that's where private equity comes in. Private equity typically are larger checks, and we typically bring, in my case, we do buyouts. So we want to do control investments where you are selling control of your business. And you may say, well, why am I selling control of my business? A, get the money, but B, what you really want is my know-how. Why do founders come to us? Because we've done it so many times in enterprise software. I can bring, remember those best practices I was telling you? Here's how you run your product development organization more efficiently. Here's how you run your go-to-market system more efficiently. Here's how you do your contract administration more efficiently. Because you've never done that before, or you've done it, but you don't necessarily know the best way to do it. And we can share experiences with you that actually can enable you to do it. Now, not all private equity people bring that. Some just bring the capital. And they say, I just want to own the business. Because if I buy the business and it's growing well over time, and they may put debt on the business, they're going to increase the value of that business. And then when they sell it, they make the difference between where they sold it and what they bought it for minus the debt that was in the company. So the way to think about that is think about buying a house. If you go and it's a house worth $100,000. I know you guys talk about this in your show. And a buyout person can come and say, all right, I'm gonna buy it for $100,000. Okay. But then they go to the bank and they borrow $60,000. So they only have to put $40,000 in. But because it's in a good neighborhood, 5 years later, it's now worth $200,000, $300,000, whatever it might be, right? Or they fixed up the house. They went in, put a new porch, and put $40,000 in to really improve the value of the house. Now I can sell it for $300,000. They sell it for $300,000. They pay back the $60,000 to the bank. They've been paying interest along the way, right? And that difference, they put in 40, the difference is what is profit. And that's what private equity firms do, okay? As an owner of a private equity firm, that difference in value, if I borrowed the money or raised the money, I've got to pay my investors back, and then I get a percentage of the profits. So that's how it works. Like 90% of the founders that we buy our companies from are still involved in the business with us or in our ecosystem, okay? And so you're taking control, but you're also investing in the infrastructure. Now you like to use words, you're accelerating the corporate maturity of that business. So it might take you 10 years to figure out what we've done 45 times already, right? And now I bring that intellectual property into the company and say, here's how we're going to design this a little differently. Here's how we're going to change your compensation plans for your salespeople to actually incentivize them to give you more stable revenues or more visibility into the future revenues and earnings of that business that you may not have figured out or may not figure out because you may not be in an environment, a circle of people who have dealt with that before. And so that's why the expertise that we bring is often more valuable than the capital.